rap since its inception has been inseparably intertwined with the spiritual, the mystical, the religious. The natural response of humans to certain rhythms, timbre, seems to be so ingrained in our consciousness as to be unavoidable. In a well-known YouTube video, musician Bobby McFerrin challenges the audience to follow his steps with adjacent musical notes. Providing a guideline for the first couple of tones, his audience miraculously managed to fill in the rest according to the pentatonic major scale. He informs us that he has repeated this experience to many different audiences around the world, with the same result. In a sense, this is a form of mysticism, accessing a deeper, hidden layer of our minds that connects us with something greater and more primal. It may not quite have the passion of Rumi's experience of being drunk on divine love, but nonetheless, there is a connection. When we think of spiritual music, particularly we may think of Sufi music, devotional chanting, ambient atmospheres, simultaneously laid back and full of movement, New Age or non-denominational spiritual music, ranging from the tacky and appropriative to the more ethereal and introspective. Church hymns sung on top of old, haunting yet warmly voiced organs, and so on and so on. There's another sub-dimension of spiritual music that rarely gets talked about. The chilled side of electronic music can often contain elements of all these, choir and organ pads, droning sounds reminiscent of chanting, or sometimes actual chanting, and the universal connection and introspection of non-denominational spiritual music. Azam Sheikh's Resonance in particular, or Merkandidi's work, combines multiple elements of these. Ambient electronic music, in a sense, could be described as agnostic, aiding in the achievement of some form of mindfulness in the listener, but not necessarily putting its money on a particular strand of spiritualism. It's often pitted to images you might see reposted on I Fucking Love Science. Space, cells multiplying, the beauty of nature and the universe, that sort of thing. One seminal artist in this genre, Carbon-Based Lifeforms, evokes that both through its name and the titles of its songs, for example, Artificial Island and Set Theory. Yet, I get much the same connection from it as I do from the Sufi-inspired works of Merkandidi. So it almost suggests that even in the artificial, there can still be a degree of the mystical. There is a definite connection here back with music that is specifically mystical rather than purely religious, relating much more with the commonly held Sufi, tasawwuf, concept of taqlid than the mainstream one which is often related to the non-dualism found in Eastern religions. While many Muslims set themselves up for the afterlife, Sufis are often characterized as seeking an experience of Allah even in the dunya, the human living world. The concepts of baraka or ishq relate the idea of there being a spiritual dimension to the world around us, perhaps the ultimate evolution as a concept as old as animism. Shintoism, which on the surface would seem to be the opposite of Islam, hyper-polytheism versus distinct monotheism, contains a similar concept. It's perhaps a matter of language and distinctions. The gods are all manifestations of nature and an interconnecting, unifying energy, which is referred to as Masubi in this context, very different to the concept of an empty idol that the Abrahamic faiths warn against. As such, the music we may have considered atheistic may just as easily be Sufi or Shinto or Buddhist, or any sort of spiritual. The key here is an absolute distinct binary between the mundane and the mystical may not in fact exist. This is key in understanding how spiritual music works. Ambient electronic music is generally quite musically simple, but rich in texture. It evokes a certain sensation. The phenomenon of ASMR may well be coming from the same sort of place, as it uses sound to evoke a certain sense of feeling a tingling down your spine that you wouldn't normally associate as coming from pure sound alone. So over time, the principles in this evolved into things like ASMR and, debatably, binaural beats, which seek to manipulate the mind into what may be considered a mystical experience in the same way real mystics may have used substances, fasting, or various intensive rituals. One particular way in which some chill-out music may achieve this is by invoking shades of what is known as hypnagogia, the transitional state between wakefulness and sleep, in which I'll talk about quite a bit here. I hope I pronounced that right. Does anyone know how to pronounce that? A number of years ago, I was heavily into the goth and post-punk genres, and generally going in for the gothic thing big time. This was not long after I came out as trans, so perhaps it was a stereotypical escape experience. Goth rock and post-punk, like the shoegaze acts they later inspired, did tend to work a lot with texture, ambience. Seminal post-punk guitarist Daniel Ash piled on the tape delay to create ambient soundscapes with his guitars. As he said himself, he liked to make a guitar sound not like a guitar. But at the same time, he often used more stereotypical guitar-like tones, except exaggerated. Ones that would be lower gain and scratchier than most other rock bands at the time, and very harpsichord-sounding acoustic piezos. Back in the 80s, piezo electronics were less advanced and tend to produce a harsher tone. But Danny Ash liked to use that in his music. And he is often quoted saying as well that he prefers the idea of wailing on a few notes to a really brilliant, long, intricate solo. I'm making space for a clip from Go Away White here. It has to be less than 10 seconds or it'll get flagged, so here we go.
Right, that's a solo there of some kind. Alright, that's good.
This juxtaposition of extreme guitariness and extreme not guitariness often melted into a blurry line. There's another genre where this sort of thing happens. Vaporwave. And we'll get to that in a minute. Some acts associated with this scene push the ambient and mystical parts further. Two that come to mind are Dead Can Dance, who perform what might be described as the less tacky version of new age music, though they would in fact contest that it's very old age, and they'd probably be right. And Black Tape for a Blue Girl. Black Tape for a Blue Girl, I think they purposely chose a bit of a tongue twister for a name, were particularly curious, as there was a sort of warm bleakness to the music. It sounded kind of like death. Rather, it sounded like an in-between place. A liminal place, transitioning to a resting place. Limbo, or the Islamic Sufi concept of barzakh, the boundary. It was also a very dreamlike place, as dreams and death often overlap, as Sufis are said to be able to access barzakh in dreamlike states. Once again, hypnagogia. Walking around the south side of Cork City at night, I often felt that warm bleakness listening to this, and thus delved further into its womb, listening to remnants of a deeper purity and mesmerized by the sirens. Much of the music I found deep and meaningful seems a little cornier to me now, perhaps. My sister kind of accidentally got me into Enigma back in the day, and I'd often feel very spiritual indeed in my pagan phase in college, listening to MCM XCAD or the best of. Curiously, I started listening to Enigma again a couple of years back, discovering their style had evolved into a more chill-out electronic genre I couldn't get enough of at the time. I'd often stay up late at my parents' listening to the Chill FM station that overtook RTE Kids in the wee hours. So the music project itself took on new hidden depths. Because relaxation, mindfulness, mystical experience is so difficult to force, the line between cheesy and intoxicatingly ethereal can often be crossed. And it will differ from person to person as to when this actually occurs. Because, again, there is no absolute distinction between the material and its inner dimensions. Nor is this more evident, perhaps, than Vaporwave. Vaporwave is a phenomenon of internet meme culture, but it's also an evolution of the same electronic music I've been talking about. Vaporwave very readily takes some of the cheesy new age music I've referenced, often referred to as music, the obvious callback for Vaporwave in many people's minds. Chop it up, slow it down, and make it into something new. Which is kind of reminiscent of the chopping and screwing you'll find, for example, a lot of Witch House and more atmospheric hip-hop. A Vaporwave artist will take a song or a sample style technique that evokes some sort of nostalgia and somehow mutate it into something different. Because we associate slower music with much more deep, meaningful experiences, and how easily it is related to the experience of hypnagogia, because time can be a little bit subjective there. Suddenly something that's little more than apparently soulless corporate background music takes on new life with a downsampling and some clever effects usage. Macintosh Plus, for example, piling on the delay, much like Danny Ash. Vaporwave itself was founded, inverted commas, by transgender artist Vectroid. Trans people having a somewhat biopunk dimension to us often have a strange relationship with the world around us, used to existing in liminal places. I am the natural and the technological. We're often thought of as being artificial beings, so sometimes we try to find hidden dimensions within that artifice. Along with its nostalgia, Vaporwave, along with sister genre Synthwave, often evokes images of cyberpunk, a setting where technologically savvy rebels survive in a near-future corporate dystopia, or, as we call it now, the present. Vaporwave, in a strange way, both critiques and warmly remembers elements of consumer capitalism. Capitalism itself being increasingly seen as a global oppressive force, it does seem strange for people such as myself who caricature and criticize it, also having a certain degree of nostalgia for images associated with it. Part of this is due to the context shift, which we'll talk about later, but it also goes back to the strange relationship that exists within resistance. We side with the cyberpunk rebels, but we're still attracted to the overall setting. Post-cyberpunk settings like Ghost in the Shell take this further. Ghost in the Shell assigns a spiritual dimension to technology, particularly seen in the original scene where Mitoko's body is being created, to a particularly mystical rendition of a traditional Japanese marriage song, wedding man and machine, traditional but technological. While expressing in the lyrics of the aptly named GITS standalone complex opening Inner Universe the depths of longing, remaining oneself and retaining meaning when the very definition of life and consciousness is challenged. Overwatch's fictional Irish religion, followed by Omnic Zenyatta and Cyborg Genji, evokes something similar. Going back to the concept of non-dualism, in a sense, they're one and the same. Yeah, because they're clearly distinct to some degree, corny corporate tunes and soulful soundscapes. Non-dualism in this sense, then, does not mean that there's no good or bad, just that the distinction blurs, and maybe in some ways subjective. The concept of yin and yang is symbolic of the concept of dualism, yet is equally non-dualist in evoking an interconnected, dependent whole. Again, we arrive at two seemingly opposite ideologies describing a similar phenomenon from a different perspective. And it's likely a perspective switch that helps give Vaporwave a more meaningful feel than the music that it's derived from or inspired by. Because sounds have an inherent meaning to us, even those created by uninspired artists or inartistic reasons can affect us in the right scenario. People too have mystical and hidden dimensions that can come out without them realizing. Earlier I referenced to spiritual music as both connective and introspective, reflective of Sufi teachings that to connect with universal oneness, you must go through yourself. Vaporwave is often related to Witch House, and non-genre in turn inspired by shoegaze, goth rock and southern hip-hop, which can be found in its thick textures. Some act like rituals, use heavy, distorted, coarse synths, screaming in your face to evoke an enveloping feeling in a similar fashion to Merzbow as My Bloody Valentine. Witch House in of itself calls back to nostalgia in these genres, as well as hip-hop, which is what pioneered the use of sampling and certain electronic techniques and devices. The chopping and screwing, slowed down samples found in both Witch House and Vaporwave are hip-hop concepts, Hip-hop itself, in the late 80s to early 90s, evolved into trip-hop, slowing itself down, taking on more chilled and deeper atmospheres. The repurposing of music evident in a variety of hip-hop derived genres on Vaporwave seems to be about a perspective shift, or more specifically, a context shift. When people consider the idea of a mystical reading of something, they consider the idea of reading between the lines in a sacred text, finding a new pattern. It's often said in Islam, within Sufi Islam, that there are many different meanings to each ayah in the Quran. Not slowing down a cheesy R&B song, though using Paul's stretch to create an epic soundscape of the Jonas Brothers was a trend for a while, but in doing so, we open up new textures, timbres that evoke something deeper, as well as strengthening the sense of nostalgia, a powerful connective force in of itself. Vaporwave takes you to a dreamlike, not quite remembering state of falling asleep, similar to old Simpsons videos on VHS. It's often anachronistic and combines things in a strange fashion, particularly evident in associated visual art style, which calls back to sometimes quite eclectic and unrefined iconography of the Windows 95 to 2000 era. Vaporwave attempts to, much like in those ASMR videos, tap into the way in which our brain processes certain sorts of information to deliver a particular experience. Video game soundtracks are a common source for Vaporwave music, but some of them already have a high degree of ambience within them, especially with the advent of CD-based music. The music of Worms 2 and Worms Armageddon, composed by Bjorn Lynn, is largely ambient electronic in a similar vein to carbon-based lifeforms or solar fields. Again, oddly juxtaposed with the cutesy surreal graphics. The CD versions of Sonic 3D contain some of Enigma send up with their Rusty Runes tracks. Even the simple sound chips of the SNES and Mega Drive were responsible for the likes of the Final Fantasy soundtracks or the Haunting Hidden Palace Zone. Either the Sonic 2 Beta one or the Sonic & Knuckles ones, they're both pretty good. The demographic that Vaporwave most appeals to was most heavily into gaming around this time. Thus, the nostalgia of the earlier part of the 90s blends together with the latter part when we're moving on to deeper, more profound experiences in a higher definition. I suppose it would be quite appropriate to say that these things simply resonate with us. Many New Age types, who may well have listened to Enigma at one point, might tell you about how it's all vibrations and frequencies, man. And in a sense they're right, given how much you respond to sound, which is just that. This sort of feeling a slow, deep, resonant, low-pass filter sweep tends to evoke in us suggests that. And Vaporwave, while admittedly still cornier and more fatiguing than other chilled electronic genres, by definition tends to have a more rolled off high end since everything is pitched downwards. Higher frequencies tend to startle us, whereas lower ones tend to envelop us, sometimes even comfort us. Of course, this in of itself isn't an absolute, like the yin and the yang containing a part of each other, but the suggestion of warmth by way of the emphasis of certain, usually but not always, lower to mid frequencies is ongoing. A lot of the old buzzy video game soundtracks sound better on old TV speakers that didn't reproduce quite as much in the high end. And of course you hear a lot about guitarists talking about warm tones and blah blah blah, and it's often things that roll off the high ends but not in a way that's too harsh. You'd often hear descriptions like woody tones or blah 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 crunch. So both with guitar tones and Vaporwave, it's almost like there's something that's gained in translation. So to some people, a Diana Ross song given a similar treatment in its lack of fidelity, emphasizing both depth and ambiguity, lulling us into that dreamlike state. In all of this, I'm reminded of the somewhat freakish yet awe-inspiring totem in the intro sequence to the American Gods TV adaptation, blending the old gods with the new concepts, technology our world revolves on, circuit-printed shrouds and tacky neon cowboys and the same psychopomp salad as Buddhas and angels. There's something deeply Vaporwave about that. True mystics, inverted commas, dervishes and the like, are often what we would consider ascetics. Ascetics? Another word I'm not sure how to pronounce. And seek a life away from worldly things. But by the same general philosophies and teachings, we can find deeper meaning even in the aesthetic. It's not a coincidence that Vaporwave harkens back to the 90s, a time in which the material, the man-made, increasingly opened us up to new experiences. So while I'm not about to throw on Macintosh Plus alongside the rain noises and John Surrey I fall asleep to, there's still something in it, and importantly, how we relate to the ever-changing world around us. So, hope you enjoyed this overly lengthy take on electronic music and why Vaporwave is actually really important and mystical. So my next video is probably blah, blah, blah. It's either going to be the third video or one I'm thinking doing with the Lego movie, actually, the Red Pill. So hopefully I'll see you all soon, and I hope this is really awesome. And if you're looking for recommendations for some awesome electronic albums that are really chill out, or some go Vaporwave, feel free to exchange them in the comments with each other, and I will post them in the description. So until then, As-Salaam Alaikum, and I love you all. Bye bye. Mwah. I can't do the echo effect on a single drum, that's ridiculous. Anyway, that's a terrible thing. Goodbye. Bye.